Hi there. In this tutorial, I'm going to demonstrate how to create a scene something like this. The idea of this is that it's a field of Barley, and I've constructed the vast majority of it using geometry nodes. So there'll be a bit of discussion on how to do that. The only element I didn't construct directly from geometry nodes was each ear of Barley, as I could have done that, but it's a lot more complexity than is really necessary for this. So you could treat this as a sort of introduction to geometry nodes. We're not going to have to worry too much about materials because, as you can see, this is essentially in silhouette. I've got a little bit of depth of field in here. I've got a background sky, and just for fun, I've added a little bit of fake God rays in there as well. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Feel free to comment or ask questions or even dislike the video. And if you don't like the video, I'd be very interested to see what the issues you spotted were so that I can improve going forward. If you're a Patreon supporter, I do upload these files for any use available to my Patreon supporters, and I upload tutorials quite regularly. So let's start the tutorial. So to begin with, we just need to create a landscape on which to put our Barley. So of course we'll just put a simple plane, scale it up a little bit, apply the scale, otherwise things can get complicated, and then go into edit mode with all the vertices selected and say subdivide. And if we come down here, I'll subdivide once more, but we'll go to this fractal element, which essentially means there will be some randomness applied to the z-axis of these points, which will give us some lumps and bumps, just to make the landscape a little more interesting. And then I'm going to right click and say subdivide again, but turn the fractal down a little bit, and perhaps subdivide once more, and then perhaps scale on the Z just to make it a little more extreme. Then I'll come out of edit mode, Control 2, and that will add subdivision surface modifier, and we'll just smooth it off a little bit. I'm going to make my camera visible and then decide where I want the camera to look from. So I'm just going to move the landscape back and forth a little bit, perhaps increase the size. And you may well find that you need to play with the clip start and end points both for the view. I think it should be fine with this one, but more importantly for the camera itself, you can see that's only 100 meters, so that will need to be greater just to be certain. In fact, I'll just set it to 1000 just to be certain that it gets everything in. And I'll set this to shade smooth. I want the camera at quite a low angle. I'm just going to bring it down and then bring it in a little bit, bring it down a little bit more, and rotate XX, just so that we've just about got the landscape in the scene, but it's not dominant in the scene at all. And just to be on the safe side, the opposite edge, I'm going to press O to turn on proportional editing, and then say GZ, increase the size a little bit, and just bend it down slightly so you don't get visibility of the edge itself. Perhaps we'll put that on sharp. You see the curve, as it were. You can't really see the edge anyway, but it just makes sure you haven't got a sort of cliff there. And then I'll just reposition things a little bit. I quite like these variations here. And I'm going to apply the subdivision surface just to make sure I've got all those points. It doesn't matter too much because the geometry node is a modifier itself, and we'll use that modifier. But it just saves worrying about where they are in the stack and so on, and accidentally putting them in the wrong place and changing something and suddenly everything changes. So this way I've got a nice stable mesh, and you can see there's a fair few points on there. While I'm here, I'm going to go into a wireframe mode, and looking through the camera, just press C, and I'm going to select the geometry that's just in front of the camera. And if we look from above, you can see that forms a kind of V shape. And we'll come to here and we'll click plus and we'll assign that. So we've now got a vertex group, which is just what the camera can see. Now, I've done that quite early because I'm confident in what I'm going to do, but you may want to do that much later. However, we're going to use that to limit where our geometry node produces particles, and that will help keep things efficient and not render lots and lots of particles that we don't necessarily need. You can cover the whole surface, of course, in particles depending on how dense you want this field to be, but you will then be rendering particles that at any given time anyway won't be visible. This is going to be a still scene now. So next I'm going to go to add image, images as planes. Make sure that's enabled if you want to use that. So under preferences, add-ons, come into here and start typing, and you can see import export images as planes. Just make sure that's enabled. And we'll just call our plane ground, and then we'll click add images as planes. I used this one. We'll say emit, and if we just come to here we can preview the plane, and we need to push it right back and then scale it up. Obviously, you can see I'm just rotating on its local x-axis there just to align it with the camera. There's other ways to do this. There's just rotate x-axis and just getting it so it looks straight. But this is just a quick and dirty way to achieve this result. And the other thing I did was go to the world. I just clicked use nodes and then under color, say environment texture, and I'll use the same environment texture, and that will add some generic light which will be based on this. So if we go to the rendered view now in cycles, you can see the landscape is being illuminated by both this plane here and the landscape. Now the other thing I want to do for that plane is come into here, turn off shadow for ray visibility, so that I'm going to be adding a sun lamp, and I don't want this plane to be casting a shadow, because sun lamps, doesn't matter whether the lamp is in front or behind, it will still cast a shadow. I like to put it where it seems it should be anyway, because it helps when you're trying to work out where the light should be shining. And we obviously need to make that sun a little reddish and probably quite a bit brighter. So we'll give the landscape a material and make it a very sort of dark brown colour, and we'll turn the roughness up just to keep it nice and dark, but it's not really going to feature in the scene. So we're ready to make the only bit of modelling we need to do, which is just a couple of things. I'll put my 3D cursor over here somewhere, and I'm going to add two things. I'm going to add a plane and a cube. So the cube is just what I'm going to use to model the Barley ear, and you can see what I'm doing. I'm just modeling it very simply. It's only going to be visible in a small way. You should probably use reference for this, but sometimes it's good just to have a general impression of something. And then just going to add the subdivision surface there and set it to shade smooth. Go into orthographic, turn on proportional editing, and we'll say smooth. And then I'm just going to rotate and move my ear, because there's going to be 4 of them, and perhaps move that one over a little bit as well, and perhaps make it a little taller. And we can add just some extra vertices just to give it a bit more curve. I experimented with just using arrays to create the whole head of the Barley, but I found it was just as easy to do that bit in geometry nodes. So with the whole thing selected, I've duplicated it, turn off proportional editing, and then rotate Z 180, and I'm just moving it in X so that they're in contact, and then again select everything, Shift D, and then rotate Z 90. So we've now got 4 ears of Barley. So we'll call that Barley ears. I'm going to call this plane Barley leaf, and we're just going to put both of those with them in a new collection, which is just called Barley. Doesn't have to be, I'm not using the collection as a collection in this instance. And I'm just making a basic leaf shape. So there's a big difference in the sizes here, not that that matters too much. I'm just putting some cuts in here just to join those points up and also give me the ability to add some shape to the leaf. So it's selecting that central row of vertices, proportional editing on again, and GY just to give a bit of curve to the leaf there, and then change to sharp, rotate on the X, bit of shape there, and then just move it over and add a subdivision surface, set it to shade smooth, and I may have forgotten to do the shade smooth on there as well. And I'll just give it a basic material. We'll call this Barley, and we'll give it a sort of yellowish colour with fairly high roughness, and we'll select our ears and the blade, and we'll copy that material to selected. So they've all got the same sort of material name, and I just need to set where the origin is. So with my Barley selected, I move it around, turn off proportional editing, and you can see the little origin point, and I just want that there. And I'll just check that it's central. And then with the leaf, obviously it needs to be at the root, as it were, of the leaf. I'm going to rotate the leaf slightly as well and just drop it there. When they're instanced, that's the origin point from where they will appear. So Barley ears and Barley leaf is now created. So we can go back to our landscape and we can start to create our geometry setup. So I'm going to open a new window and we'll change to geometry node editor. We've got the landscape selected or ground, and we're just going to say new for geometry nodes. So here's our geometry. If I was to disconnect that, the ground disappears, so we don't want to do that. We want to have the ground in this scene for the moment. And we'll add, under geometry, a join geometry node and just drop that there. It's a very useful node. So now we can create some things and then add them into the geometry. So first of all, I want to create some points on the faces. So if I press F3, I can search, and we will search for distribute points on faces. So we'll add that. You notice there's a switch node, which essentially allows you, if you've already got a node selected, to change that node for, in this case, distribute points on faces, but we want to add that node in this case. So we'll add that there, and we'll take the geometry into there, and the output we'll put into there. You can now see we've actually got a load of little points appear. So that's essentially where things would appear if I start to instance them. And how many points you get will depend on the density. Currently it's set to random. So as I increase the density, we get a lot more points. And because we often need to play around with things without having to get into what can be quite complex node setups, this won't be too bad. It's always worth, for this sort of thing, taking this out to that little unused node there, which means that it will appear here. There's actually another reason we want to do that as well, and I'll actually do that now. So you can see this strange little flag symbol. This is what sets the density. If you remember, we set up a vertex group. So if you want to join that vertex group or use that vertex group to define the density, this is how we can do it. If we go back to the geometry node, click that, and then click in here, you can see there is the group set up here. And if I click that, now you can see we've only got points within that triangle that we set. Now, we would also want to be able to control the density. So what I then did was I just added a math node into density and change that to multiply, and then take the value again out. And if we come over to here, press N, and we go to group, we can select the one called value and change the name to something like density mult, whatever makes sense to you. And now I've got a number here which will allow me to vary how many points I get within that group. I'm going to keep the number of points relatively low at the moment. And now we need to do something with that. So we've got some points. So I'm now going to add an instance on points node. We'll drop that there, and that can just drop in there. And it's all disappeared at the moment. And that's because we're not instancing anything in particular. So I'm going to add, under curve primitives, a Bezier segment. And if I just connected that to instance, you can see we've got a load of little lines appear. So here are the various values. If I start to modify these, you can see curve moves around, or parts of it move around. So I set X to 0 and Z to minus 0.5 as a starting point. And then that's the start point, the start handle. So on curves, you have these handles which define what direction the curve is going in. I set those to 0 for X and Y and minus 0.3 for Z. I just played around with the values till I got the sort of shape I was looking for. The end handle I set to 3.4, which happens to be meters, and the end, the one I left where it was, and the Z I set to 3.9. So they're a bit big at the moment, but that doesn't matter. So you can see, although they're all identical, we've got this little gentle curve now, which is the start of what we need for our barley. So we've got a little group we're going to make now. I'll group it once we've constructed it. So I'm going to add a node which is a resample curve node, and I'm going to drop that there. And this allows me to effectively define how many points that curve is going to have, if not how many, the distance between those points. I'm going to use the same values as I used originally, but we may need to adjust those. So you can see here we can set 10 points along our curve. What I ended up doing was change this to length, and I set it to 0.075, happens to be meters. So that will create a point every 0.075 meters. The next thing I wanted to do was add something called a trim curve node, and I'll drop that in there. I left it on factor, and you can see you have a start and end point. If I start to change the start point, you can see what happens is parts of my curve start to disappear till it's all gone when I get to the top. So as I say, I'm going to use the same values as I used before, and we'll see if I need to tweak them later. So I've now just got a curve which is just the very top. And now I'm going to add a curve to points node. Drop that there. You can see we've got some giant points up here. But I'm actually going to add another instance on points. I'm going to disconnect that one for the moment, because this is going to be a little group. I'm going to add another join geometry node, and I'm going to take this one in separately for the moment. Now I'm going to look over here and grab my Barley ears and just drag them from the outliner into here, and you can see it creates an object info node, which is my Barley ears. Because I may need it, I'm going to also add a transform node, geometry transform node, and I'm going to take my geometry from my Barley ears into that, and then the output of that goes into the instance input on instance on points node. And now you can see we've got some giant Barley ears up here, obviously too big, so the number I used was 0.025 for the scale. So we can now zoom in, and we can see we're starting to get something that looks like the top of a barley. Obviously the angles aren't right yet, so now I'm going to take the rotation output into the rotation input on the instance on points, and you can see that's turned them all around. You may need to do that slightly differently. There is a Euler node that will rotate things, Euler rotation, differently, but I find this was good enough. So we can now select all of those nodes we just created, not the Bezier segment node, right click and just say group. And if we right click it, we can rename that as Barley ears. I'm going to break that connection now, and we'll click instance up here. So now you can see we've got a load of Barley ears. They're all facing the same way at the moment. They're all the same size, but nevertheless, they've all been instanced. So that's a good start. But I'm now going to duplicate that join node and just drop that in there. It doesn't make any difference to start with, but it allows us to add some more geometry in a moment. So I now need a stem for my Barley, a curve to mesh node. We'll put that there, and we'll take our curve into there. Holding shift down, I'm just drawing a line just to add a little node there, just to tidy it up a bit. And I'm also going to now add a curve circle node. Put that here, and that's going to form the profile of this mesh. So it will create a mesh from that curve, and we will then use a circle to create three-dimensionality to it, because obviously curves don't have anything other than the line itself. And then we'll take that mesh and drop that into the instance as well. Obviously it's a bit large at the moment. I set the resolution down to simply 8, it doesn't need to be too high, and the radius to 0.02. So that's somewhere around right. Maybe we'll go even slightly smaller than that, 0.015 perhaps, something like that. So that's the stem of the barley, and now we just need some leaves. So fortunately we've done most of the work for that. So I'm going to grab my Barley ears here. In fact, I think I'm just going to move these two down a little bit. Grab my Barley ears, Shift D, just to duplicate them. We'll rename this one as Barley leaves, and we'll copy it in for now, but obviously it's just creating the same thing right now, so you won't see any difference. Now you'll notice we've got a little 2 in here, which means these essentially are connected. So if you edit one, it will edit the other. We don't want to do that, so I'm going to click the little 2 there, and now they're independent. If we go in here, first of all, we're going to change this to Barley leaf. No obvious difference yet. You may just be able to see there's something sticking out there, but obviously the leaves are not in the same area as the ears, so we need to make some changes. So we'll stick with the same length for the moment for the resample, but the trim curve needs to be very different. So if we start to drag this down, you can see these little tiny leaves are appearing along here. So rather than 10 leaves, let's come down to just 4 for the moment. We'll just make them a bit bigger so we can see what we're doing. They're obviously not right yet. One of the things I obviously do need to do is apply scale on the leaf. There we go. That's altered the aspect ratio a bit. Clearly they're not right yet. So that's 4 leaves. Go down a little bit on the start point and then drag the end point back a little. You can see that now brings that top leaf back a bit. So now I'm going to do some rotation. If I take that out, you can see there it is, and if I put it back, there's rotation again. That's not quite right, obviously. I'm going to add a rotate Euler, or Euler as it's properly pronounced, and just drop that there. I'll leave it on Euler and object, but I can now start to change the angle here. The scale's probably going to need to change as well. I think definitely the leaf can be wider. That's getting better, but obviously they're all appearing on one side at the moment. I think I used about 66 degrees, but you just have to try what works for you. I put -66 in there. Yeah, it looks fine. But I also wanted it to change with each leaf. I didn't want every leaf to appear on the same side. So this requires a slightly less intuitive trick. I'm just going to add some nodes. I'm adding an index node. So essentially a number, which is which point are we talking about. Each point has a number, an index, and this defines which point that is. So it's an integer coming out of here, depending on which point is being instanced. Also added another math node and set that to multiply. And again, I will use the same values as I used before, and then we'll see if we need to tweak them. But this was 3.6. And then I'm going to add a combine X, Y, Z and take that value into Z. So this is the local Z axis, and this is going to rotate it based on the index multiplied by 3.6. And that's going to go into the other side of the rotate by Euler. I've just applied rotation, and that's now working as expected. This is the thing with geometry nodes, you do need to do that. And we can play around with exactly how it works. You can now see each leaf is coming out at a different value. And if I play with this multiplier, if that's 0, they all appear on the same side of the stem. As it goes up, they rotate around. So you can just play around with it really, just to get something which you quite like the look of. And if you need to tweak another element of it, you can there as well. So what I also wanted to do was change the size of the leaf based on which leaf it was. So I'm going to duplicate that math node and change this to subtract. Put the index into the bottom side and then set this to 3. I may need to set it to 4 because I've got 4 leaves. So I'm going to change that. My previous one only did 3 leaves. But we'll see how it works out. I think we'll go with 3 leaves. And in order to control things separately, I actually added 2 rotate Euler nodes and put this into the second one. And that just allowed me to control the angle of the leaf independently of the rotation of the leaf. Geometry nodes can get quite complicated quite quickly, as you can see, but that's why I'm taking it a step at a time. I think at this point we can see I probably want to modify the geometry of my leaf a little bit. So I've added some extra vertices there. I'm just going to rotate that bit, something like that, just so the leaf sort of looks more like it's coming out of the stem. I think my leaves are upside down actually, so there they go. So now we get back to tweaking the size of our leaves. So I've got this subtract node. I'm currently subtracting the index from 3 because I've got only 3 leaves now. So I've just tweaked around these 3 values here to get something that looks a bit better. You can, by the way, use these other options, and they may give you more immediately usable outputs. They're also related to rotation, so that's tangent there. But generally rotation will just work. So I've got a subtract node here, duplicate that, and we'll change that to multiply. And I'm going to set that to 0.15 and join the output of the subtract node into there. So we're just processing this number. We're basically trying to convert this integer into a value which would give us a scale which changes for each object. And because we want the same number for all 3 of the axes, X, Y and Z, we want them all to change together, we can just directly use the number. We don't have to convert it to a vector as such. So I can now just take that and put that into the scale input here. So now our transform is way too small, so I'll just set that to 1. So for this particular version, something like 0.3, 0.35 maybe is around the sort of value. And you can see the biggest leaf is the bottom leaf, and then it's the next leaf and the next leaf. And then we can play around with the positions of these leaves with the start and end point. I'm just pushing that leaf down a little bit there. Obviously every stalk is identical at the moment. We haven't got any sort of randomization, but we'll address that in a moment. It may be a little big, so we'll perhaps go down 0.3, and we're obviously going to go down on the overall size anyway and make that smaller. I'll go back to 0.35, and the multiply value will simply adjust how quickly it goes from big to small or small to big. You can see 0.25 gives me a much bigger leaf at the bottom. I've got something like 0.175, so we'll go with that. Press tab, I come out of that, so that's given me my barley ears, the leaves, and this one is giving me the stem. So now what I need to do is vary things like the scale and the angle, the rotation, the Z rotation at least, of my barley plants. So you can see I can rotate them with the Z value there, but that's obviously rotating them all together, and I can change the scale there, but I don't want them again to be all the same. I want there to be some variation. So I'm now going to add a random value node, and because I want to vary only the Z of the rotation, I'm going to add a combine XYZ node. This is producing a float. You can set it to vector. This is just how I did it. I put this into here, I put that value into Z, and then the rest of it comes into here. And if you increase that, you can see you just get more and more variation. And now I've got them pointing in various different directions. I used -11 to 1, but it doesn't matter too much. You just play with this till you get a good mix of rotations. So for scale, let's create a new random node. We'll put the value we've got in here at the moment, which is 0.1, into both of those. And then we'll just take that into scale. So it hasn't made any difference because there's no change at the moment. If I increase that, you can now see we start to get different size plants. Because I've taken this float value directly into scale, which is a vector, it will be putting the same value into each one, so we won't get any strangely distorted plants. X, Y, and Z will be scaled by the same amount. If I increase that, I'm going to increase the minimum a bit as well. Let's have a look through the camera. So we've got a few plants which are already big enough that they're out of the scene. A lot of them are not, so I'm just going to increase that one. So that's starting to look okay from a size distribution standpoint by the looks of things. You may not want them to vary too much because they all would be very, very similar. Parts of this won't have a material. The leaves and the ears do, but as you can see, the stem does not. And that's because it was created from a primitive. So the easiest thing to do is just to add a set material node. And I just drop that in there. And you can see that they've all changed now because it doesn't know what material to set to. And then I'll select my Barley material. And now you can see they're all set to the same material. And that is all there is for the geometry node setup. So it does create quite a complex setup, and obviously there are nodes in here as well, but it's not too difficult to work out how everything's affecting it. The other thing I wired out was to take the seed out as well, and that just allows me to very quickly, while looking through the camera, try different distributions. So it's still the same density, but it's different distributions. So we can actually try and increase density now. So you can see I'm turning that up, I'm getting more and more, and then try a different seed. That's probably a bit too dense for this scene. You want some close to the camera and some far away, obviously. And I'm just repositioning my sun lamp now, and we can have a look at that. So you can see we've got quite a bit of light on these leaves, and if you don't want as much light as that, then what we can do is turn the strength of the background down. I'll set that to 0.1, and you can see they're much darker now. They've still got a little bit of light on there, but they're much darker. And we can play around with the sun. I ended up using an angle, so this is very bright pinpoint sun, or close to pinpoint sun at the moment, which isn't right for this scene because obviously it's quite distributed light. So I went up to 10 degrees. The other thing we can do is, because there's no need for them, under light paths, we can turn off caustics, which will make it render a bit more quickly. And we really don't need that many samples. 128 is fine. And I think ultimately this will render fine in EV as well, but I decided to render it in cycles. But now you can see, because I've made the sun a little larger, I'm getting some light being picked up along the edge of certain things, so that helps. I think I made my leaves 3D as well, so at the moment they're just infinitely thin, as it were. So to do that, I'm just going to go into here and then add a modifier, which is a solidify modifier, and that just gives the leaves a little bit of thickness. You can see it there. We don't want them too thick, and the subdivision surface needs to be on the bottom so that it smooths out that edge of the leaf. So now our leaves have got a bit of 3D to them, so we can see what that looks like in the rendered view. Obviously it's just a noisy render at the moment. You can already see we're getting some light picked out along the edges of certain things. So just very quickly, I'm going to go to the compositor. We'll say use nodes. Over here I'm going to go to render passes, and we're going to turn on denoising data. I'm going to add a filter, which is a denoise filter. Take denoising normal into there, albedo into there, and the image into there, and then that goes out to here. So we'll let that render and see how that's doing. But before we do, I'm just going to come down to performance and just set the tile size to 512. You'll just have to experiment to see what works for you, or what works most efficiently for you. And I'm just going to, just for the speed of the demonstration, I'm just going to set the max samples down to 32, so it's not many samples. So that looks okay. There's just a couple of things I want to do to add to it. What I will do for the moment is I'm going to mute this node, and you can see it becomes noisy again because it takes quite a while to carry out the denoising, which it will do every time I make any changes. So I'm now going to add, under filter, the sunbeams node. I'm just going to drop it in there like that at the moment. And I used a ray length of about 0.3. And you can see we're getting a weird effect here. And what we have to do is that's the bright part of or brightest part of the scene, and we need our rays to come from there. So if I start changing this number, it takes a second to calculate it, and you can see that's now moved over to there. We'll go one more click, so it's about there, and then we need to move down the image, and you can see that's pretty close to where it needs to be. That's below, so that's there. That's the rays themselves. And what I want to do now is add a color mix node, change that to add, and take the original image into the top, and I set a factor of about 0.5. Obviously it's not denoised at the moment, and you can see we're getting the sun rays effect there. So if I unmute, pressing M, the denoise option, it takes a little while to do it, and there you can see the smoothed scene and with our sun rays. So the only thing left to do now is the depth of field. So we'll come out of here, we'll select our camera, and I'm actually just going to add, under empties, a plain axis empty, and there it is. It's made it nice and big so we can see it. It doesn't really matter where it is in the scene other than forward and back, as it were, for the camera, so it's really just setting the depth at which we want to focus. So let's try that, and then under the camera settings, we select our camera, go to the camera settings, turn on depth of field, and you can see everything's gone blurry. We're in the preview image at the moment, and tell it to focus on the empty. So now everything's back in focus, and we can just about see there's a bit of defocus there. I'm now going to turn the f-stop down, and you can see as we go smaller and smaller, things that are really close to the camera have gone out of focus, as have things in distance, and things in sort of middle distance are the ones that are in focus. And I've got that at about 0.4, I think I went to 0.3, something like that. And I actually went for a slightly smaller camera angle as well, but I'm going to stick with what we've got. I'm just going to give that a final render now. So there it is. You can obviously adjust gamma and things like that, or exposure, depending on what effect you're trying to make. You may want to apply a vignette, that kind of thing. The only thing I would say about depth of field is don't overuse it. I do think it's often used inappropriately. So if you're rendering a scene which is human size, there shouldn't be very much depth of field in it. If on the other hand you're rendering a scene which is perhaps representing little models, then you need plenty of depth of field, and you can see that little bit of depth of field here gives you the sense that these things aren't as big as a human. They're only a meter high at most. So I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. If you did, let me know. If you've got any questions or anything like that about the tutorial, or about any of the elements of the tutorial, or about anything else for Blender, feel free to message me in the comments below. I read all the comments, and I will try to answer all of them if I can. So hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.